To what extent are the sanctions imposed on Russia by the international community following the invasion of Ukraine working? This is the question, the big question, that is constantly being thrown around. It is the starting point of the whole debate revolving around the Ukrainian war. And do you know what? We will be able to find answers for all tastes. For some, the sanctions are proving to be a tremendous failure. Of course, there is no lack of data to support their thesis. The Russian war machine has not stopped. Unemployment in the country is low. Russia's economy continues to grow, and inflation remains at reasonable levels of around 5%. Meanwhile, for others, sanctions are gradually crushing Russia's productive capacity. For example, the trade surplus between January and August plummeted by almost 70% compared to the previous year. This represents nothing short of a loss of more than $150 billion. Logically, at the time, the government's oil revenues have also plummeted, and the budget deficit is no longer a source of good news for the Kremlin. Of course, investment inflows into the country are also drying up, and foreign travel is expensive and severely limited. A good reflection of this can be seen in the evolution of the ruble. Despite all the capital controls, the Russian currency continues to fall. It hasn't quite dropped to monopoly money status, but the chart is not exactly flattering. This is basically because capital outflows from the country are already greater than the inflows of new foreign currency, and that's not even all. The steady decline in the value of the ruble, coupled with the increased military spending, has forced the authorities to take action. Specifically, the central bank has had to raise interest rates sharply to prevent inflation from spiraling out of control. We're talking about rates that are already at 12%. As you can imagine, this is not the best news for families and entrepreneurs. Between one thing and another, Bloomberg now puts the probability of Russia going into recession in the next 6 months at 21%, up from 6% just over a month ago. The probability of recession is still not very high, but the trend seems clear. Things are deteriorating. So then, are the sanctions working? Well, the truth is that it depends. If we're talking about punishing the Russian war machine, the truth is no, they're not working very well. In the short term, the blow to Russia has been limited. But if we're talking about limiting the Kremlin's economic and military capacity in the long term, that's another matter. There, yes, sanctions can be very successful. Of course, whatever the case, in this video, our intention is not to talk about the greater or lesser damage that sanctions are causing to the Russian economy. At least, not directly. We have already talked about all that recently on our sister channel, VisualPolitik, and if you haven't seen it yet, don't hesitate to check it out. The thing is that in this video, we want to touch on a topic directly related to this issue, but from a very different perspective. You see, a study by the Peterson Institute for International Economics has revealed that during 2022, Russian energy companies accumulated a kind of fortune in opaque foreign accounts of about $147 billion. What's more, during the first 6 months of this year, this pot may have increased by another $50 billion. In total, in a year and a half, we're talking about almost $200 billion that today are in the hands of giants such as Lukoil, the largest Russian oil company, or even state-owned companies such as Rosneft or Gazprom. We're talking about a formidable amount of money in international currencies that many analysts believe Russia could eventually use to pay for its war effort. For example, have you seen this news item?
Russia-North Korea arms talks are actively advancing. US warns.
Well, who knows? Perhaps Pyongyang's support will be paid for, largely with Uncle Sam's own dollars. You already know that Kim Jong-un's regime is desperate to get hold of dollars, among other things, to pay for the great leader's expensive whims. And you know what? This all has a lot to do with some very important flaws in the sanctions that have been applied to Russia, which has caused us at VisualPolitik to ask ourselves a few questions. How is it possible that Russian companies have amassed such a fortune? To what extent is Russia circumventing sanctions? What else is the Kremlin doing to dodge Western punishment? Well, let's answer all these questions. Let's get on with it.
For every law, there is a loophole.
VisualPolitik community, of all the sanctions imposed on Russia to limit its military capacity, two of the most important ones are freezing the central bank's assets abroad, some $350 million, and secondly, the oil embargo on Europe and the fixing of the famous price cap on Russian crude oil at the international level. Remember that before the war, Russia was above all a major exporter of crude oil. No gas, no uranium, no weapons. The money came mainly from oil. Well, it did and still does. Oil and its derivatives derivatives are by far its largest export. So the first question we can ask ourselves is, did the sanctions work? Well, in theory, yes. Due to the European Union embargo, European buyers of Russian oil have virtually disappeared. Russia has had to channel a large part of its crude to other markets, something for which it has had to assume huge discounts. This has been said 1,000 times. In fact, in an attempt to stem this bleeding, Russia had to join the oil production cut promoted by Saudi Arabia. This meant cutting production by about 500,000 barrels a day, just at a time when Russia needs every penny it can get.
Novak says Russia to extend 500,000 BPD oil production cut until end of year.
In principle, the Kremlin's idea, logically, is that the increase in price of oil, as a consequence of reducing supply, will compensate for the drop in production. But let's not get sidetracked, that's another story. The point is that despite the fact the government's oil revenues have been greatly reduced, Russia has not only continued to place its oil, but also the large Russian companies in this industry, including some state-owned companies such as Rosneft and Gazprom, have made money and accumulated a huge fortune of close to $200 billion. $200 billion that could now be largely available for the government. But okay, let's go step by step to understand this story, to understand why, despite all the sanctions applied, petrodollars have continued to flow massively in one form or another into Moscow. First, the European embargo on crude oil had some exceptions. We are talking, for example, about Russian oil reaching refineries connected to the Druzhba pipeline, one of the largest pipelines in the world. Many refineries had no alternatives, so crude oil was allowed to keep flowing, and it still does. Look at the case, for instance, of the Czech Republic. In 2021, Russian oil accounted for 49% of all its imports. In 2022, 56%, and in 2023, 65%.
Russian oil grabs bigger slice of Czech imports despite reduction aim.
Supposedly, they are working to reverse this situation, but in the meantime, money, money, money. The same thing happened in Bulgaria, where the Russian oil company Lukoil had a virtual monopoly of the industry. For this reason, permission was granted to this country to continue importing Russian crude oil, even by sea, for 2 more years. Second, it may surprise you, but Russian oil giants such as Rosneft and Lukoil have several refineries that are wholly or partially owned by them. We're talking about refineries such as Zeeland in the Netherlands, in which Lukoil has a 45% stake of, or 3 other refineries that the same company has or had in Italy, Bulgaria, and Romania. Well, what they did here was to take advantage of the fact that oil from the Urals was traded very cheaply to supply all these refineries. Refineries which then sold their gasoline, diesel, and other derivatives at market prices in Europe with prices that were sky high. This explains why countries such as Italy and Bulgaria doubled their purchases of Russian oil for months. The margin was gigantic. To give you an idea, if normally a refinery has a margin of $10, when converting a barrel of oil into fuel, in these refineries, the margin multiplied to between $40 and $50. Suddenly, these facilities became veritable gold mines. If there were a Forbes list of refineries, these would definitely be on the cover. They were super profitable, which made their Russian owners a massive fortune. We are talking about a huge mountain of euros and dollars that the Russian companies then took great care to hide far and wide around the globe through a lot of subsidiaries and overlapping companies. Let's go on the world tour of the financial hideouts. In fact, in this graph, you can see the Russian oil supply to Europe during 2022. Although the total arrival of crude oil was reduced, there was no reduction in oil directly purchased by subsidiaries of Russian companies themselves, or that from the pipeline supplying Hungary and the Czech Republic. So there you have it. Germany, for example, ended up expropriating 2 refineries owned by Rosneft and Gazprom, but for a while, they made a lot of cash. There are other facilities that have been sold in deals, which in many cases, well, what can I say? Let's just say that the Russians know how to take care of their money. The fact is that this is how Russia has obtained a lot of foreign currency. Remember that the government and the central bank have had their reserve operations in dollars and euros restricted. However, the same is not true for companies, state-owned or private. In other words, we are looking at a kind of oil trampoline. In fact, let me ask you a question. How much of Russia's money was frozen? About $300 billion in foreign currency. And how much have the oil companies stockpiled in just a year and a half? $200 billion. Okay, they haven't made up the entire difference yet, yet, but Putin already has all the dollars he needs for whatever he really wants. Import chips via Kazakhstan, perhaps. Maybe import modern machinery via Armenia, or pay North Korea for its tons of ammunition. Whatever is needed. Yes, okay, it's true, this money is not strictly government money, but what the heck? We're talking about Russia. It's all about the Kremlin. Remember, we're talking about a country where the government went so far as to mount its own private military. So one way or another, there's no doubt in Moscow, they will find the formula to use this entire empire as they please. But VisualPolitik community, that is not all. There are even more reasons why the river of dollars has continued to flow to Russia. Thirdly, Russia has been looking for alternative markets to place its oil. We've talked about them a lot of times. We're referring to countries like China, India, and even some African republics. The point is that we are talking about countries that did not directly join the price cap set by the G7, the European Union, and Australia. But perhaps the most striking thing here, it's not that these countries did not join this agreement, but that the Western plan does not seem to have been implemented particularly well either. What do I mean? Well, you see, according to various estimates, during the first 6 months of 2023, about half of all Russian exports from Pacific ports, where the selling price exceeded the limit, were made on ships owned or insured by companies of countries that had subscribed to the price cap. We're talking above all about Greece. Take a look.
Greeks dominate Russian oil exports. According to Fortexa, a data analytics company, the tanker fleet involved in Russian trade post-sanctions is predominantly operated by Greeks.
To give you an idea of what we're talking about, in the first 4 months of 2023 alone, these companies transported or secured the transportation of more than $40 billion of Russian crude oil. In other words, in one way or another, not everything possible has been done. Yes, the idea of a price cap is that Russian oil would continue to flow on the global market, but at a limited price. And that has only been partially achieved. Of course, this brings us directly to an absolutely key issue. Have you noticed something? All these companies are now absolutely indispensable for Moscow. It is no longer just a question of whether they sell more or less crude oil. The point is that they now also hold the treasure chest of Russian national wealth. And do you know what this means? That if, in the medium term, alternative and sufficient sources of crude oil were to be found, we could go directly up against Russian oil companies. And that, yes, could be a terrible blow for Russia. So the question is, don't they know this in Moscow? Well, yes, of course they do, but that's the way it is. Even so, the strategy to counteract this possibility right now is essentially threefold. First, that these companies hide as much money as possible. Second, do what they are already doing with trade. Make more use of currencies of allied countries. Since 2022, for example, the weight of the dollar and the euro in Russian trade has fallen from 80% to less than 50%. Well, something similar would probably happen with a large part of the reserves of the oil giants. In other words, we will soon see a lot of Russian investments outside the West. And third, to at least try to limit the public deficit, they are passing legal reforms to make these giants contribute more to the public coffers. Until now, for example, taxes on oil production were indexed to the price of Urals crude, which is why their revenues fell so much after the oil price cap was set. Since then, however, the rules have been changing. In this way, Moscow's scope for action will be greater. This, in fact, explains why the budget numbers have improved in recent months. Then, along with all these oil-related techniques, there is one other aspect. I am talking about what is known as the Eurasian traffic circle. Russia is using neighboring countries to bypass international restrictions. This is the case, for example, in Armenia. Exports from this small Caucasus country of just 2.7 million inhabitants to Russia have increased fourfold. At the same time, its purchases from the European Union, the United States, the United Kingdom, and Japan have tripled. You know what this means, don't you? That's exactly what it means. Between one thing and another, I'm sure you can now understand why Moscow's restaurants are still full, why the shopping malls don't seem to have undergone major changes, and why things are apparently not going so badly. Nevertheless, wait a minute, nobody should be fooled. Everything that we have seen in this video are tricks, traps, strategies with which Putin has bypassed the sanctions for now. But in the long run, the Russian economy will suffer a lot. All these products now coming into the country are much more expensive. Foreign investment is going to be sunk for a long time, and young professionals will do everything possible to escape the country. Firstly, in order to have a future, and secondly, to avoid being called up. In the long run, all this will affect the country's already disastrous productivity levels. But for now, Putin is surviving. The question is, What do you think Ukraine's Western allies should do? Should they take this issue more seriously? Would you pursue state-owned enterprises' assets across the board? In what ways do you think Moscow's war effort could be truly punished? As always, leave your ideas below. And as in the legendary credo of YouTube content creators, if you found this video interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe to VisualPolitik if you haven't already done so. Thank you so very much for watching. All the best. See you next time.